By their own standard, South Carolina's women's basketball team is on fire as of late from three-point range, and that should terrify every other team that remains in the NCAA tournament.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions do apply. It's going to be all basketball on this Monday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Later on in the show, we're going to look back at the men's basketball team, quickly talk about what they accomplished this season, and look at the three burning questions for Lamont Paris and the staff heading into his second full off season as South Carolina's head coach. But we're going to start off today's show by talking about Dawn Staley and the women's basketball team and what they've been doing as of late in the NCAA tournament. Obviously, so far, South Carolina has dispatched both of their opponents in the Presbyterian Blue Hose and the North Carolina Tar Heels, whom they faced in the first round and in the round of 32, respectively, this past weekend. But the thing that really stuck out in both of these wins was the Gamecocks' three-point shooting barrage, which, when looking at the numbers, should worry everybody else that might end up playing South Carolina in the NCAA tournament, because if it continues, it could very well be the reason that the Gamecocks win the program's third ever national championship. So let's look at some of the Gamecocks' recent three-point shooting performances, starting with their performance against the LSU Tigers in the SEC Tournament Championship game. In that contest, the Gamecocks shot 7 of 20 from behind the arc, or 35%, which obviously might not be the most efficient, but it's still pretty respectable, especially considering the volume of shots that they took. Now, in the first round, or the round of 64, against Presbyterian, South Carolina shot 9 of 24 from 3, or 37.5%. So a little bit better than what they did against LSU a couple weeks prior in the SEC tournament. And then yesterday afternoon, in what was a blowout victory against the North Carolina Tar Heels, the Gamecocks shot 9 of 20 from the floor behind the three-point line. That is good for 45%. Oh, by the way, South Carolina was 8 of 10 from three-point range in just the first 20 minutes of that game. Now, in terms of an individual standout in this three-point shooting barrage that has taken place recently, that player would absolutely be Mylasia Fulwiley, who is shooting 13 of 22 from behind the arc in those 3 games. And obviously, we've talked about this before, that is huge for Mylasia Fulwiley and, quite frankly, this entire offense, because when Mylasia Fulwiley is a player that you have to respect from behind the three-point line, defenders cannot sag off of her. They can't just leave her be and basically hope that she just settles for that shot for a whole game and that maybe she'll miss it more often than not, therefore leading to some more positive results for them on the defensive end. Now, defenders have to stay with Fulwiley at all times. This will open the door for Fulwiley to drive more to the basket, where obviously she can make magic happen. That's the best way to describe Mylasia Fulwiley's game when she is on. And when Mylasia Fulwiley is able to do pretty much whatever she wants on the floor, it also opens things up for everybody else. And I've said this before, and I caught a little bit of flack for this, Malaysia Fulwiley is the one true shot creator that this basketball team has. That does not mean that this team doesn't have any other talented players. Obviously, the team does. Camilo Cardoso in the post. Raven Johnson's a very good floor general at that point guard spot. Tahina Paopao, the best sharpshooter at the shooting guard spot in the entire country, in my opinion. But none of them can create their own shot in a variety of ways like Malaysia Fulwiley can. And when you've got that one player that is just on throughout the course of 40 minutes, it opens things up for everybody. And in South Carolina's case, you see a performance like they had on Sunday afternoon against the Tar Heels in the Colonial Life Arena. Essentially, they become dang near unstoppable on that end of the floor. And think about this. Last year, South Carolina, this team is already displaying some different results than what last year's team had in the NCAA tournament. If we all remember, the Gamecocks last year in the first round played, I believe it was Norfolk State, a 16 seed, but a 16 seed that was highly respectable for their seeding line. One of the better defenses in the entire country, irregardless of conference. And they gave South Carolina a pretty good fight for, again, the kind of competition that it was. And then the second round, South Carolina played the Miami Hurricanes. And they shot terribly from the floor. And I believe that they still won the game handedly, but it was not a dominant win. So far, South Carolina has had little to no time where they've had to actually be worried or concerned about the game's end result. That's something that we could not say about last year's team, as good as it was and as experienced as the players were on that squad. And so that is something that if you are an opposing team, an opposing coach, especially in South Carolina's regional, and you are still playing in the NCAA tournament as of Monday morning, by the time this show comes out, then you are going to be in serious trouble when you cross paths with the South Carolina Gamecocks. The main reason that a lot of people point to when we talk about why this team didn't win the national title last year is because as good as Aaliyah Boston was, as good as Zia Cook was, and a bunch of other players on that team, South Carolina as a whole wasn't a great three-point shooting team. Maybe not even a good three-point shooting team. And when they faced a player like Caitlin Clark, who can literally hit about any shot possible on the floor, it came back to bite them in the end. This year's team, that's not going to happen. Sure, they could eventually just hit a wall in one of these games, maybe in the Sweet 16 or Elite 8, if they make it that far, assuming they do. And they could go, say, 2 for 16 from 3. We have seen this team do that as well. But right now, with the way this team is shooting the basketball, nobody's going to be able to stop them, in my opinion. Nobody. Now, that does not mean that there aren't teams that the Gamecocks should look out for, and that includes the fans as well. So after having seen a few games play out in the NCAA tournament, I have decided to power rank the 3 biggest challenges for South Carolina as of this very moment, based on what we've seen so far in this tournament. We'll discuss those 3 teams in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show and this week's March Madness bracket highlight is brought to you by our friends at Nissan. Each week, we're picking one team that stands out, a team that's pushed it further than the rest, just like any of the all-new 2024 Nissan SUVs. These guys were able to take it to the next level. The NC State Wolfpack are obviously this week's Nissan Rogue. The team absolutely surprised us all with a powerful performance in their first 2 games in the NCAA tournament. Wins over Texas Tech and Oakland have set them up to play Marquette in the Sweet 16. They say win life, go Rogue, and that's exactly what the Wolfpack has done here. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Today's show is also brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed going all the way, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. And why not continue to talk about the NC State Wolfpack? The Wolfpack did this back in 1983 with Jim Valvano, the late great Jim Valvano, winning the conference tournament in the ACC and then making a run all the way to the national title game and winning it. Right now, FanDuel has the odds for the Wolfpack set at plus 12,000. So, if you think DJ Burns and NC State can go on another magical run once again, might not be a bad bet to put some money on. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Welcome back to this Monday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecocks sports coverage. The Locked On College Basketball Bracket Breakdown Show is now available on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. Experts Andy Patton and Isaac Shade will break down their brackets and discuss everything that you need to know to fill out a winning bracket and prepare for this year's NCAA tournament. Find the Locked On Bracket Breakdown now on the Locked On College Basketball podcast, wherever you get your podcasts daily. Okay. Now, South Carolina, again, if they keep shooting like they have from three-point range throughout the rest of the tournament, then I think that we can all confidently say the Gamecocks are going to win the national championship. But again, as we all saw last year and as we've seen in previous seasons before the 2022-23 season, sometimes there can still be the right matchup, or in this case, the wrong matchup that takes place and knocks you out of the tournament. And so I decided to go and look at the teams remaining in the tournament to see who might be the Gamecocks' biggest challengers as of right now. So, starting off with number 1, I've got to go with the team that would be familiar with South Carolina purely because of the head coach that they have, and that is the Texas Longhorns. Now, I start off with the experience factor, and I already alluded to their head coach, Vic Schaefer. Vic Schaefer and Don Staley, as we've talked about several times, obviously, they have had their share of battles in the past, both in the SEC and also on the national stage in the NCAA tournament. Vic Schaefer has a ton of experience when it comes to making deep runs in March. He has been to the Final Four on 3 previous occasions, twice as a head coach with the Mississippi State Bulldogs and once as an assistant coach over at Texas A&M. Ironically enough. And now he is leading the Longhorns to a number 1 overall seed, a number 1 seed. He has led them to that mark this season. And the Longhorns, at least in their first game, looked pretty good. They defeated Drexel 82-42, which I believe was the second largest margin of victory out of all of the number 1 seeds, behind just South Carolina this past weekend. Now, the Longhorns did have to work a little bit harder to defeat the Alabama Crimson Tide in the second round on Sunday. I believe they won that game by only 10 points. But again, you kind of expect that when you have a team like Texas that's still trying to build up the depth like a South Carolina has, and you go up against a team in Alabama that has a ton of experience in their own right. And speaking of experience, the Longhorns have 3 of their top 5 scorers listed as juniors or seniors or graduates. So they've got some veterans on their squad to pair up with their veteran coach that could lead to a deep run and an eventual Final Four matchup with Don Staley's Gamecocks. So right now, I've got the Texas Longhorns at number 1 in terms of the biggest challengers that remain for South Carolina. Now, number 2, as of this very moment, I've got the Tennessee Lady Volunteers. Look, when the Lady Volunteers keep performing like they have over the past several weeks, at some point, you just got to put your hands down on the table and you just got to say, the Lady Volunteers might be peaking at the right time. Tennessee had a sneaky 6 versus 11 matchup this past weekend against Green Bay. Not the Green Bay Packers like in the NFL, but no, just Green Bay University or College. But Green Bay had won 10 out of their last 11 games. And by the way, out of the entire NCAA Division I level, only 2 programs since the early 90s, I want to say 1994, have made the NCAA tournament every single year. One of those teams, Tennessee, the other being Green Bay. So there's a lot of history there with that mid-major program. And despite all of that, Tennessee went out there and largely took care of business. They won 92-63. I was very impressed with the Lady Volunteers' performance. The other reason why this could be a really tough challenge, should South Carolina and Tennessee meet up for the 4th time this season, is the fact that Tennessee, unlike most teams, actually has some front court players that can kind of match up with South Carolina. Obviously, they've got future WNBA player Rickea Jackson, largely projected to be a top 3 pick in the upcoming WNBA draft. They've got another player in Tamari Key, who has the length advantage and can actually match up with a Camila Cardoso when it comes to that overall length and height. And they've also got Sarah Puckett, who's kind of a hybrid wing / power forward. She can do a little bit of everything. She can rebound, she can shoot the ball, and she's just overall quite scrappy and somebody that's not afraid to really challenge South Carolina's front court players. And again, you got to respect her for that, because a lot of teams, they are kind of a bit imposed and or intimidated by South Carolina. But Tennessee does not seem to feel that way, and that showed in each of their 3 matchups with South Carolina this season, as the combined point margin of victory for the Gamecocks from those 3 games was 20 points, including obviously that buzzer-beating win against the Volunteers in the semifinals of the SEC Women's Basketball Tournament. So, I have to admit, I did not expect to say this even just a couple weeks ago, but right now, as of this very moment, I think Tennessee is the 2nd biggest challenger in this bracket for South Carolina. Plus, they are in the other regional that is on South Carolina's side of the bracket. So that would be a Final Four matchup if they do make it out of their regional in the Elite 8. Now, I really bounced a lot between multiple teams for this 3rd spot, but I wound up landing on the UCLA Bruins. Now, the reason for this is, one, UCLA, I do believe they still have another game to play later today, but UCLA, they also look pretty good in their first round matchup against California Baptist. They won that game 84-55, one of the better performances out of teams on the 1 and 2 seed lines in the first round. Also, just like I mentioned with Texas, there's a familiarity here between the Gamecocks and the Bruins, because both of these programs faced off against one another twice this past season. One of those games being in the Sweet 16 in last year's NCAA tournament. And another reason why I list the Bruins here is because, kind of like I mentioned with Tennessee and how their front court can actually match up with South Carolina and is not necessarily afraid to go up against them, the Bruins have a center in Lauren Betts, who I believe is also actually 6'7". So literally one of the only players at the high major level that could actually stare into the eyes of Camila Cardoso. And Lauren Betts is also quite skilled as well, just like Cardoso. So if that matchup were to take place, it would be in the national championship game, but it would be a prize title fight between those two in the paint area if that were to happen. So, in terms of the Gamecocks' 3 biggest challenges that are remaining in the NCAA tournament, I have got the Texas Longhorns, followed by the Tennessee Lady Volunteers, and the UCLA Bruins taking that 3rd spot. We'll see, of course, if maybe some things will change with this ranking once we address it again next week. Now, we're going to end today's show with a little bit of men's basketball. And unfortunately, the Gamecocks season did end this past Thursday against the Oregon Ducks. It just was not the Gamecocks' day offensively nor defensively, as Jermaine Couisnard pretty much went out there on a mission to make sure that his college career did not end at least in the first round, and he definitely more than accomplished that. So now that the season is over, it's time to look towards the future for Lamont Paris and the Gamecocks. What are the 3 burning questions that Paris and this staff will have to answer this offseason? We'll discuss those questions in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you always want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you should check out LinkedIn Jobs today, because they have the tools to help find the right professionals for your team, both faster and for free. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals worldwide, giving you access that you quite literally can't find anywhere else. And also, it is a primary catalyst for why 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours when they use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire the people that you need to hire. So let them take it off your plate. Post your job for free today at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free today. Terms and conditions do apply. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. Okay, there's going to be 3 major questions that Lamont Paris and this staff with South Carolina's men's basketball program have to answer this offseason, and for the most part, in relatively short order. So let's go ahead and address these one by one. Starting off with what is, in my opinion, the biggest question, which is who is going to replace Ta'Lon Cooper at the point guard position? Out of all the players that South Carolina had on this team this past season, I don't think there was any player that was more important to this group than Ta'Lon Cooper. Ta'Lon Cooper was a calming presence at that point guard spot. The experience that he had built up throughout his college career always was on display when he had the ball in his hands throughout the course of a basketball game, especially in some of South Carolina's bigger games. And unfortunately for Lamont Paris and company, Cooper is now walking out the door and is moving on as his eligibility has been exhausted. And looking at the roster the way it's constructed right now, you don't really have a true point guard on the roster. The closest that you probably can point to in that regard is probably Morris Ugasuk. And right now, he's got a lot of developing that he has to do this offseason in terms of his body, in terms of his confidence, which is the case with most freshmen, and also just the different ways that he attacks defenders. Morris has a lot that he has to do before he's ready to be a, say, starting point guard on an SEC basketball team. And as of right now, you don't have a high school point guard that's enrolling into the program this offseason unless Eli Ellis decides to reclassify from 2025 to 2024, which, I mean, heck, never say never, but right now you cannot bank on that happening. So, to this point, the Gamecocks have contacted 3 transfer point guards. The first one I'll throw out there is Furman's J.P. Pegues. Pegues played against Lamont Paris when Lamont was with the Chattanooga Moccasins in the 2021-22 season in the Southern Conference. That's where he knows Pegues. Pegues averaged 18.4 points, 4.8 assists, and 4.3 rebounds per game this past season. By far the best player on Furman's basketball team. There's familiarity there. So South Carolina, I think that he should be the number 1 target, quite frankly, at point guard in the transfer portal. Another guy to monitor here is Tennessee Martin's Jordan Sears. Now, Sears is basically a volume scoring threat. He averaged 21.6 points and 4.5 assists per game this season, along with 4.6 rebounds. So, really good stat line there. His 21.6 points per game on average was, I believe, top 20 in the entire country. So, you want a little bit more offensive juice at the point guard spot next year, Sears might be the guy you want to look at. And then the last one is an intriguing option. Virginia Military Institute's Tyron Cook. Now, before you brush this to the side and say, why is South Carolina looking at a guy from VMI? Hear me out real quick. South Carolina, if you recall, they played VMI this past basketball season. And in that game, Cook actually did a pretty good job against the Gamecocks, scoring 16 points on 54.5% shooting from the floor, all while recording 3 steals on the defensive end. So Cook proved that night in front of Lamont Paris and his entire staff that he can play against high major competition and perform at a high level. For the whole season, Cook averaged 12.7 points, 2.8 rebounds, and 2.4 assists per game. The other thing to note with Cook is he is a rising sophomore. He just concluded his freshman campaign. So this kid still has a lot of growing and a lot of developing that he could do. If he's a guy that they end up landing, do not write him off just because of where he's coming from. Needless to say, look out for a point guard transfer to come into this program once again this offseason. Now, the second question that the Gamecocks have got to answer this offseason is, how are they going to utilize Colin Murray-Boyles? Lamont Paris has already alluded to this in a couple of his recent press conferences. Kyle Murray-Boyles, there's more to his game than what we saw this past season. Murray-Boyles is not just a guy that's just going to go into the paint area and play with his back to the basket. That's an explosive athlete that can also grab a bunch of boards and play above his size. That is not his entire game. Murray-Boyles can also do some things out near the perimeter. Apparently was a guy that was shooting the 3-ball quite well before mononucleosis unfortunately took hold this past preseason. So the question is, how are you going to utilize arguably your most talented player on this roster as of right now? I would say Colin Murray-Boyles will fill more of a BJ Mack role next year, where Murray-Boyles will still play at times with his back to the basket, but maybe he'll also do some more pick and pop outside the 3-point line. Maybe he'll be the guy taking those shots instead of BJ Mack, who took them obviously this season. And you could see why in that regard the Gamecocks didn't have Murray-Boyles doing it this year, because you already had a guy in Mack that was doing that. And you got to have somebody in the paint area to try and grab rebounds. You can't just play 5 out. At least that's not what South Carolina seemed to want to do. So assuming that that's going to be the case again next season, I would say Colin Murray-Boyles will play more of a true 4 type role where he's going to be asked to do a little bit of everything on the offensive end. So that's my guess, but obviously we got a whole offseason to go through before we actually find out what they're going to do in terms of utilizing Colin Murray-Boyles. And the last question is a pretty simple one. What is this roster going to look like? As of right now, we know that Talon Cooper, BJ Mack, and Stephen Clark, they're all gone no matter what. Their eligibility has been exhausted. There's no way that either of those guys can come back. Meechie Johnson, currently, everybody is waiting for his decision. Meechie's a guy that going to the season, you could probably have assumed he was probably going to go to the NBA as long as the season went well for him. And while he did have a good year with a couple of really solid games, Meechie also was a little bit up and down. He did have his slumps offensively this year in terms of scoring. So, if that's something that the NBA decides to hold against him, who knows? Maybe Meechie turns around and decides, you know what? I got a little bit more I can prove and I could come back. Honestly, I would not be surprised with either decision that he makes. Whether he decides to go ahead and take his chance at the NBA, or if he decides to come back to Columbia for one final season. Either way, I don't think that Meechie Johnson is leaning strongly toward either direction as of this very moment in time. I, again, could see this going one way or another. So we'll see as time passes what Meechie decides to do, but certainly that is something that could affect how Lamont Paris and the staff approach this offseason in terms of trying to bring in some new players to make sure that this team continues to be in contention in the SEC and for a tournament bid this next season. And then there's a few other guys that right now, it's not a guarantee that they're going to be gone, but I could see a path one way or another where they're not on the team next year. And the guys I'm talking about here are Josh Gray, Benjamin Bosman for Donk, and Miles Studi. With Josh Gray and Benjamin Bosman for Donk, it's simply, are both of these guys willing to continue to play basketball? Josh Gray and Bosman for Donk, I think both of those guys, they've kind of shown in their own personality through videos that have been posted by the social media team and all that, they've got interest outside of basketball. Heck, Bosman's for Dunk is working to become a lawyer. He's working to get his law degree at South Carolina. So he certainly has a much different path than playing basketball, and that will begin in the very near future. So for both of those guys, do they want to come back from one more season, go through the grind of an off-season strength conditioning program? We can't bank on that. Josh Gray's played college ball for, I think, 4 years now, and I think it's the same deal with Benjamin Bosman for Donk. And then with Miles Stute, this was a tough year for him. Ton of injuries. He was unfortunately the one player that was bit by the injury bug severely, pretty much lost his starting spot to Zachary Davis. I don't think that was all on him. I think that, quite frankly, Coach Lamont Paris just loves Zachary so much because of his defense. And again, Stute was just really banged up, and so it didn't make sense to throw him right back into the starting lineup once he came back from a multi-week absence. So with Stute maybe not knowing if he's going to be a starter next year or not, is he going to want to stick around? You can understand why he would maybe look around if he's not going to be guaranteed a starting role on this team next year. So in my opinion, that is something to monitor as well. Not saying it's going to happen. Please don't take it that way. Just saying, realistically speaking, especially with what we've seen on the football side of things in the transfer portal, we cannot rule out that possibility. So those are the three biggest questions for Lamont Paris and the men's basketball program this offseason. And with that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are y'all's thoughts on the women's basketball team's recent three-point shooting outburst, and how do you think it changes their chances to win the national championship? Who do you think the biggest challengers are for Dawn Staley and her team as of right now? And lastly, what do you think the biggest offseason questions are for Lamont Paris and the men's basketball program? No matter what your thoughts are, let me know down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or you can shoot me a direct message on X at @ALion_SC if you listened to today's show on an audio podcast app. As always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Monday and a fantastic start to the work week. I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.